Hello, my name's Nikki Sinclaire. I'm the founder and coordinator of Campaign for Referendum, and I was an MEP for the West Midlands region in the United Kingdom. And we forced David Cameron to the dispatch box on the issue of a referendum back in 2011. But here we are now in 2014. We are really in the 11th hour in our fight for the right to determine our own future and the way we are governed. Our actions in the forthcoming year will be imperative to our nation's sovereignty. Our political elite from all the main parties has brought us into this plight. They have constantly ignored the will of you, the people. Both the Tories and Labour have pushed through legislation by stealth that has compromised our country's independence. Those of us that are warned of this growing danger take no satisfaction from the troubles of the euro and the EU economic meltdown. Europe, and in particular the Eurozone, are the worst performing area in the world. Now it is more than ever that it is important to listen to what we say. Further ventures along the Euro road to federalisation will lead us to losing our country forever. Quite simply, we must leave the EU for the best interest of this country to prosper. Britain is a leading member of NATO, a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, the mother of the Commonwealth spanning a third of the globe, a member of the G7 of the leading economies of the world. Indeed, we are the sixth largest economy in the world, and we are easily strong enough to be independent of the EU. Our best interests lie in trading globally, as we've done over the centuries, not restricting ourselves to a small protectionist zone as those little Europeans would have us. We were promised by the Europhiles in the early 70s that a trading alliance, yes, a trading alliance, they deliberately hid and lied to us about the rest. It would create employment and generate greater wealth. Well, let's look at those lies. From having a trade surplus with the EU when we joined, we now have a trade deficit. Since we joined, Britain has handed over £220 billion net, and allowing for inflation, that figure increases to easily over £500 billion net. We are the second largest contributors to the EU, contributing more than France. In return, our fishing fleets have been destroyed, our small businesses smothered by mountains of unnecessary EU regulations, which in turn leads to unemployment. We need only look across the channel to see the unemployment problems they are enduring, especially amongst the young. All this whilst their own unemployment is falling. The British people are about to have practised upon them a trick even more cruder and more shameless than that in which they were cheated out of their inheritance of parliamentary self-government in the first place, when we acceded to the European Economic Community, the forerunner of today's European Union. However, since the trick is basically the same one over again, it is to be hoped that the people will not be taken in again, but will listen to those who warned them correctly before. When the proposal was put forward that Britain should join the EU in 1971-72, and again in the referendum in 1975, and again in subsequent government election manifestos, the people were told officially and solemnly by the political parties that the British Parliament will lose none of its effective power. With the benefit of hindsight, we know these promises to be untrue. Indeed, the only time that the British people have had a direct sale relationship with Europe was in that 1975 referendum, in which we were told that the government had succeeded in securing a New Deal for Britain. A New Deal that promised food security only 20 or so years after rationing had ended. Tell that to the million people who are now dependent on food banks some 40 years on. Another promise and observation from the 1975 New Deal, and I quote, "There was a threat to employment in Britain from the movement of the common market towards economic and monetary union. This could have forced us to accept fixed exchange rates for the pound, restricting industrial growth and so putting jobs at risk. This threat has been removed." Well, that was 1975, yet we endured Black Wednesday in 1992, with the UK's membership of the EU exchange rate mechanism, with millions of pounds of our national wealth evaporated instantly. We warned of a European superstate when the UK was becoming a province of we were laughed at and scorned. Now we find ourselves in the reality, with Juncker likely to become president of the EU Commission, an arch-federalist. Of all the silliest sayings, surely the silliest of the sayings is you cannot put the clock back. Of course you can put the clock back, and you often do if the clock is showing us the wrong time, and you can put it back or forward, whatever is necessary without the slightest hesitation. And in the nation, if a mistake has been made, we ought to put it right if we can. Some mistakes in individual life can be irreversible, and they may be, though more rarely so, in the life of a nation. But we ought to always be on our guard against those who tell us so. Those who whisper in our ear, it's done now and can't be undone. For those are commonly the voices of cowardice or indolence, and sometimes of downright evil intent. A person who wishes the United Kingdom to remain a member of the European Union, and who thereby commits himself to this nation being part of a European state, can be as honourable as the next, and I won't deny that, as long as he acknowledges the consequences of his opinion. He may be filled with the benevolence to his fellow man and generally convinced as individuals the peoples inhabiting this country will enjoy the important advantages as European citizens they cannot have as British nationals. But one thing he cannot be, for he cannot be a patriot. For the basis of his action and intention is the conviction that this country is no longer or ought no longer be a patriot, a nation state, whose people acknowledge no external human authority and who owe no higher secular allegiance. Certainly the mistake that Britain made in giving up its parliamentary self-governance and independence to become a part of the EU is not irreversible. One would suppose it was, and that's what you are intended to suppose, to listen to the chorus of politicians and journalists who keep chanting, "We are in the EU, we can't leave." Whether you like it or not, most of them ought to know that this is not true. Whenever it is repeated, it is the repetition of a falsehood, conscious or not. Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty is the formal mechanism for an EU member state to leave the Union. An Act of Parliament is all that is needed to invoke that article. Roll on the day. For all the anguish of the Europhiles, it becomes more evident with every passing month that the issue of Britain inside or outside the EU is not just one live issue among many, but it is the central political issue of the day, which all roads in politics lead back. The battle over Britain's national existence and parliamentary independence is a battle which will be fought, through to the bitter end, however long it lasts, and it's a battle which all political lines and links will be overrun and broken, as it surges one way or the other. It is a battle that the campaign for a referendum has demonstrated that politicians from across the political spectrum will come together, irrelevant of their ideological differences. Now, I've quoted the law to you, the formal legal position, but it will be disingenuous to pretend there is not a higher ideal, according to which no nation can be bowed against its will to a surrender and renunciation of its freedom, independence and sovereign identity. The right to a nationhood is one of those rights which it might be said time does not run against it. Scotland, for example, who gave up their right to parliamentary self-government in the Act of Union in 1707, has regained it partially and now seeks to regain full independence. If Scotland can make this decision, why can't the UK decide on its independence from the EU? History is littered, and some of its most glorious pages are adorned with instances of nations which reasserted and reclaimed its right to govern themselves and live under their own laws and policies, not 10, 20 or 30 years after the eclipse, but after centuries. There is no superior jurisprudence which can ever rightfully say to a nation, you shall not or you shall no longer be the masters of your own fate. I doubt indeed that any nation can ever be brought to renounce its own self-mastery except it was deceived, except by means of trickery and cheating. Certainly it was deception that Britain hijacked into the EU in the first place. It was by deception that was induced to give retrospective assent to the hijacking at the referendum in 1975, and again by successive governments, both Labour and Conservative and Lib Dem coalitions, who have taken us further without consultation and without divulging the true facts. The Tories will tell you that they can renegotiate powers back from the EU. Well, this is another piece of electoral deception that could go alongside the 1970 Conservative Manifesto pledge of our commitment is to negotiate nothing less, nothing more. And of course, the 1992 in Maastricht, when they made us all citizens of the European Union without the consent of the British people. This was a constitutional change that required a referendum. The same soft soap has been used again prior to the last general election, with Cameron's cast-iron guarantee of a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. Cast-iron man became tin pot man. Is there any wonder that the vast majority of the British people do not believe that he will win any significant concessions from the EU to repatriate powers back to Westminster? Indeed, can we really trust him to deliver an in-and-out referendum at all? Our legal system is almost lost to the EU. We are currently bit by bit handing over our legal system and replacing it with corpus juris, the Napoleonic system where you are judged guilty until proven innocent. EU arrest warrants undermine our legal safeguards. Our right to silence has already been breached, and the government is removing our rights as created by Magna Carta to be judged by our peers. Habeas corpus, to be detained only with sufficient evidence, is already on its way out. Our courts see the European law as superior to our own common and statute law, thereby infringing on parliamentary sovereignty, which in turn removes the power of the electorate to make the change if they so wish. Both the Liberal and the Labour parties will take us into a federal Europe if they only disagree on the timescale. The Conservative policy comes straight out of Noddyland. I ask you, how can you be part of a club yet not observe its rules? How will they manifest their policy once described as in Europe and not run by Europe? Which of the tens of 1,000 regulations imposed on us since we joined will they repeal? How will they renegotiate with the French and the Germans when they won't negotiate? Quite simply, we still cannot trust the Tories with our country. Therefore, I urge you to support the campaign for a referendum. Shortly after the general election in 2010, Cameron gave that speech, and he clearly said, probably very mindful of the last Conservative government, which was racked and ruined by the Maastricht Treaty of John Major, who lost power in 1997. Cameron said that he wanted to stop banging on about Europe. Who would blame him putting his own political self-interest first? But I noticed in that coalition document a small paragraph that actually said, if a campaign was to achieve more than 100,000 signatures, it may force a debate in Parliament. So I set up that campaign to collect those 100,000 signatures. We went to the length and the breadth of the country. People from all political parties joined in to help us achieve our aim. And we collected those signatures. A cross-party delegation led by myself handed those signatures in September 2011. And we subsequently forced a debate in Parliament in October 2011. The main parties put a 3-line whip, which means they did not allow a free vote by their MPs. But even after a 3-line whip, 81 Conservative MPs rebelled against the government. 2 parliamentary private secretaries resigned. Although the motion was lost, a significant damage to David Cameron's position of not banging on had been achieved. Since then, he hasn't been able to do anything but talk about Europe. And indeed, subsequently, some months afterwards, he promised a referendum, albeit in 2017, after this renegotiation, whatever that means. Now, one thing I should say about renegotiation with anything with the EU is that to get any significant renegotiation from the fundamental powers that the EU holds over us, for example, freedom of movement, our legal system, our employment system, needs unanimity. All 28 member states must agree to that change. I believe this is a con by David Cameron. I do not believe that any significant renegotiation. It will be a rerun of that 1975 referendum, where we were promised certain things, and as I've already demonstrated, that promise that there would be no link in our pound to exchange rate, how that terribly damaged our economy, our country, if we remember that Black Wednesday. Can we trust David Cameron to deliver? I don't believe we can. So therefore, what can we do? It must be for us, the people, irrespective of our party loyalties, whoever we voted for in the last general election or the European election, those of us that feel passionately that the British people should be given a say on whether or not they should be governed by the European Union or the politicians at Westminster. It is us, the people, that once again, we've done it once by bringing David Cameron to the dispatch box and answering him and making him feel uncomfortable. In the lead up to the general election next year, we must not allow our elite politicians and those also who say they want Britain to leave the European Union, we must not let them fall from the promises they made. We must be there at their ankles sniping away, because we have been deceived as a country far too long. from Blair's promise of a referendum on the Constitution / Lisbon that never materialised, to the constant promises by Conservative leaders that they will represent our interests in Europe, only to give more and more powers away. So I invite you to join us in the campaign for the referendum, to challenge the political elite, to challenge the right for us to govern ourselves. Please join us. Thank you.